of 1791. What separates the Polish and American constitutions is the difference between a constitution that survived and a constitution that did not. The Polish constitution was an example that inspired the world, even if it had remained in Poland a dream of what might have been. When Poland became one of the first countries in the world to adopt a written document after the United States and France, the idea was considered so revolutionary, so novel, so dangerous, that as we saw in the film, the autocratic leaders of Russia, Prussia, and Austria joined together to stamp it out. The Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791 is one of the direct reasons why less than 4 years later, Russia, Prussia, and Austria combined to partition Poland, wiping the country off the maps of the world for the next 123 years. From 1795 until 1918, the word Poland appeared on no one's maps. Poland's erasure from the map of Europe set into motion whole chains of events that we still feel today. The successful partition of Poland in 1795 brought sighs of relief from its partitioners. The democratic ideals contained in the Constitution of the 3rd of May, limited government and human rights, no longer were a threat to the autocratic rulers of Europe. And they would even buy more time at the Congress of Vienna in the next 25 years. But I invite you to engage in a thought experiment with me. One initially proposed by Alex Storzyński in his excellent book, The Peasant Prince, Tadeusz Kościuszko and the Age of Revolution. What if the Constitution of the 3rd of May had succeeded? What if it had actually gone into force? Would Russia, Prussia, and Austria have been able to remain as autocratic as there was if there was a democratic Poland stuck in the middle of them? Consider how isolated little West Berlin was, and yet how it remained a beacon of hope, not just for East Germany, but the whole Soviet bloc. Little West Berlin was such a threat, you had to build a wall around it. Could human and civil rights have remained so limited in Russia, Prussia, and Austria if the promise of the Constitution of the 3rd of May that, quote, all power in civil society is derived from the will of the people, unquote, had been put into effect? And if Russia, Prussia, and Austria had set out on different courses in 1795 instead of 1918, would there have been a World War I? We can never know. But had they succeeded, it could have changed the lives of nations. It certainly changed the lives of the Poles who are sitting in this room. The Polish-American community, American Polonia, would certainly have looked different if there had been a Constitution of the 3rd of May. Because the Constitution of the 3rd of May was suppressed, because Poland was partitioned, Poland was an area of political repression and economic impoverishment. That in turn led to pressure to emigrate. In short, many of us probably would not be here today if what had happened to Poland after the defeat of the Constitution of the 3rd of May did not. Yeah, there were individual Poles in the United States before there was the United States. There were Poles in Jamestown. They brought with them a conviction about human equality, and they didn't hesitate to launch America's first strike, insisting that glass that they made was no less valuable because it didn't come from wasp British hands. There were Poles in the American Revolution. They brought with them convictions about human freedom and equality. Kazimierz Puławski laid down his life in the name of freedom. The only senior foreign officer to die for the American Republic. Tadeusz Kościuszko put his money where Thomas Jefferson's mouth was, handing over the payments the US Congress gave him for service in the Revolution to buy the freedom of African Americans, including, unsuccessfully, Mr. Jefferson. But American Polonia was built on less famous heroes. They were heroes more like the anonymous Poles of Jamestown, or Pulaski of Savannah, or Kościuszko of West Point. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 2 million people came from the lands of Poland to settle America. They came because of 19th century Poland's political impotence and economic impoverishment. Impotence and impoverishment attributable to her loss of independence after the Constitution of the 3rd of May. I call them heroes because, like Puławski and Kościuszko, they made America great. Maybe they didn't build West Point like Kościuszko, but they built Detroit by making cars. Maybe they didn't forge a chain of iron across the Hudson like Kościuszko, but they forged steel in Gary, in South Bend, and in Pittsburgh. They might not have died like Puławski at Savannah, but they were mowed down in places like Homestead, Pennsylvania. They shed their blood in West Virginia and Pennsylvania coal mines. They worked the foundries of Saginaw and the auto plants of Dearborn. They sewed shirts in Jersey City and rolled cigars in Hartford. They smelted copper in Perth Amboy and shucked oysters in Baltimore. In New England, fathers and sons went to the wooden paper mills while mothers and daughters went to the textile mills. Polish immigrants farmed the lands railroads abandoned as unproductive in Wisconsin, and they cultivated the plains of Nebraska. And with the meager wages that they made in those jobs, in the factories and foundries and steel mills, they built Polonia, including Orchard Lake. The Orchard Lake schools, founded in Detroit in 1885, are situated halfway between the great urban centers of Polonia on the East Coast and Chicago to serve the needs of God and country. Mention of the Orchard Lake School should also make us remember another fact about 19th century Poland. Poland's long burial in the 19th century taught Poles to preserve their identity, their language, and their culture, even if they didn't have a state to help them do it. Poland did not exist on a map, it existed in the heart and in the mind. In the heart of every Pole who would not be assimilated, who would not surrender who he was. We should not forget that Russia, Prussia, and Austria not only extinguished Poland's independence, but they actively sought to suppress its culture. All three partitioning powers adopted aggressive policies of denaturalization, their own individual Kulturkampfe, to suppress Polish identity, language, culture, and even religion. Here again, immigration reinforced what Poles were learning at home. In Poland, people learned to preserve their identity even if they didn't have a country. Overseas, that sense of oneness grew even stronger. In Poland, you might be a Wielkopolanin, a Góral, a Galician. But in America, you quickly discovered you spoke one language. You were a Pole. You were different than these other guys here. And that is why Poles valued church and education so much. The working men and women who made America great by their sweat and blood gave their pennies, nickels, and dimes to build a magnificent parish network in America that in its heyday was more than 1,000 churches. Those immigrants also invested to educate their sons and later their daughters by supporting the Orchard Lake schools, convinced that their offspring would play a role in their new country, as well as one that would one day help their old country gain its freedom. And then came 1918, the year of Poland's resurrection. Although we are here to honor the Constitution of the 3rd of May, let us not forget this year that we are also marking the centennial of Poland's recovery of its independence. 100 years ago, on November 11th, 1918, the Poland that was wiped off of Europe's maps by the Constitution of the 3rd of May returned to those maps proudly. If we could use a time machine to go back 100 years, what would we have seen? 100 years ago, American Polonia was still new and growing, although immigrants were still coming in, although the door would be slammed shut within the next 5 years. They were poor. The ethnic enclaves of America's industrial cities were the ghettos of their day. But the churches they built in the Polish cathedral style rivaled the cathedrals of Europe. I am sure that the members of this audience would affirm that places like St. Adalbert, Swedish Heart, Assumption, and Mount Carmel were the prides of their neighborhoods. 100 years ago, the Orchard Lake schools had just moved to Orchard Lake. Although Detroit was still very Polish back then, Father Buchaczkowski had moved the Polish seminary out to the sticks of rural Oakland County. Even when I first came here as a college freshman to Orchard Lake in 1977, the schools were still in the outer suburbs, although by that time Bloomfield Hills was more affluent. But in 1918, Polish Americans were saving their quarters not just to build churches, but to buy war bonds, hoping that Poland's rebirth would be at hand. And for the previous 3 years, young Polish boys were crossing the Detroit River and Lake St. Clair to Canada to join Haller's Blue Army to fight for a free Poland. And their hopes were not illusory. Woodrow Wilson, the man who lost Polish votes in 1912 because he didn't see a need for further substandard Slavic immigration, evolved to include among his famous 14 points proclaimed in January 1918, a call for an independent Polish state with access to the sea. By November, World War I was over, and Poland stood again among the free nations of the world. 100 years is not a long time in the life of a nation. Let us not also forget that during those 100 years, Poland again lost her freedom for 50 of them. From 1939 to 1945 at the hands of German and Soviet occupation, and from 1945 to 1989 as a satellite of the Soviet Union. We Polish Americans should not forget that in the 227 years since the Constitution of the 3rd of May, Poland has really had freedom for only 54 of them, less than the life of a man. 100 years later, Polonia is also changing. Polonia today is changing. Many Central European ethnic communities that established themselves in the early 20th century, like the Slovaks or the Hungarians, are largely assimilated. Polonia gained an immense lease on life as the result of another tragedy, World War II. The post-World War II political immigration, the emigracja polityczna, brought patriotic Poles to America who had fought on all fronts in World War II and refused to live in a communist Poland. Those immigrants revitalized the Polish-American community, rebuilt its institutions, and together with the earlier immigrants and through the work of organizations like the Polish-American Congress, helped achieve the dream of a free and independent Poland, keeping it alive until the annus mirabilis of 1989. Polonia today is very different. Assimilation is taking its toll. Immigration is slower. The jobs that gave Polish Americans prosperity a century ago are gone. The vital cities of the Northeast and Midwest to which Poles flocked a century ago are now called the Rust Belt. The crown jewels of Polish America, its churches, have been decimated. Changing demographics and residual prejudice by bishops against ethnic parishes have resulted in